Hello, and welcome to the podcast of the National Institute for Health and Care Research, the NIHR. My name is Keerti Gedela. I'm your host, and I'm really excited to share conversations with different NHS and research staff to understand challenges around equality, diversity, and inclusion. So let's make a start and get ready for some conversations to cultivate change. Right, today I have the privilege to be talking with Professor Robina Coker. Robina is a professor of practice and a consultant in respiratory medicine based at the Hammersmith Hospital. Robina, you've worked in clinical medicine for over 35 years.
That's right, Gertie, I have, yes.
And you specialise in respiratory medicine with a subspecialty expertise in sarcoidosis and interstitial lung disease.
Exactly, that's right.
So I want to take you some years back, that's okay, and ask you what motivated you into a career in medicine.
Yes, thank you, Gertie. And I'd start by saying it's a real privilege to be here, so thank you for asking me to come. It's quite interesting when I look back because I realised that my interest in research probably began at quite an early age. I was always interested in science and the natural world in particular and how things work. And when I was 8, I was very unwell for quite a number of months with pneumonia, followed by asthma. And I had to take quite a long time off school. And I think that's when I realised how important it is to have good health and how hard it is when that's taken away from you. And I realised what a valuable role can be played by those in the healthcare professions. And then later on, when I was at secondary school, I realised I wanted to be a part of that. And that's when I decided to study medicine.
Have you been happy with that journey? Is that something that you feel positive now, some years later? Do you have any regrets?
No, I don't think I have any regrets. I was very fortunate. I had quite a few people give me advice and talk about a career in medicine. Nowadays, there's a lot of advice out there for people, and there's a lot online. There was very much less in those days. But I do say to people, you must think about what it's going to ask of you. Because although it's been made much easier, particularly for women to study medicine and for women to work less than full time and train less than full time and so on, at the end of the day, and I mean literally at the end of the day at 5 o'clock, when you get that call about a patient who's deteriorating, you cannot just say, well, actually, I'm off now and I've got a theatre ticket and I'm meeting my friend in half an hour. Actually, it's the patient in front of you who has to take priority. You may have a colleague you can hand over to, but you're going to have to assess that patient and then hand over, and that will take at least 30 minutes usually. And so I think people need to realise you always have to prioritise patients above everything else. And if you can do that, and that's what you want to do, then that's fine. But if you can't, I think you might want to think about something else. Or you do a less demanding specialty. There are outpatient specialties which allow you to work part-time. My cousin is a doctor in the States, and she worked 2.5 days a week, and she was a dermatologist, which was very much an office-based job, so she didn't have to deal with emergencies. She pulled out of hospital medicine as soon as she could so that she could have her children and spend time with them. So there are options, but people just have to think about it carefully.
Yeah. No, I think that's really interesting. And Robina, I've always thought that type of very robust work ethic it's the foundation of the NHS. And I wonder, and I just take your perspective on this, is how that's changing actually. I mean, when you start as a clinician, even when I started as a clinician, the environment's very different now. The dynamic related to the internet, digital media, etc., it's dramatically changed the landscape, really, hasn't it?
Yes, it has.
I wonder, yes, and the NHS.
Yes, I think it has. I think the thing that really has made a difference for junior doctors and made their lives harder has been the fragmentation of the team, because of the fact that everybody works shifts now. And obviously, I'm not suggesting that when I was training, what we did was a good thing. For instance, when I was a registrar, I would be on call from Friday morning to Monday evening in the same hospital, spending the weekend there, and there would be no guaranteed rest. And I'm not suggesting one should go back to that. But shift work is very disruptive, and it's not just disruptive in terms of your sleep, wake rhythms, and all the rest of it, and the impact on health, but it's also disruptive because it disrupts the continuity of team
Mm,
work
mm,
and the continuity of care for the patient. So when I was very junior, I learnt very quickly. I still remember the first patient I ever gave frusemide to. Nurse, well, I think you'd better give them some frusemide. And we learnt about frusemide at medical school. My registrar was somewhere else looking after patients in A&E, and I was on the ward. And I gave the lowest dose I thought I could get away with. But, there's that thing, well, I've never prescribed this before, but we trained to prescribe, so prescribe it.
mm.
And then the beauty of having some continuity of care is that you can see the patient in a few hours or the following morning, and you realize they're a bit less breathless. You had heart failure. So that gives you courage to give it regularly. And maybe we should perhaps give a little bit more. And you learn so quickly, but then you learn that, well, they might lose potassium, so their potassium result might come back low. What are you going to do about that? So you learn very quickly because you follow people through.
Yeah.
And I think that's the other element about it. You don't have the same continuity of teamwork, so you don't work with the same consultants and the same registrars, so you don't build those relationships,
Mm.
and you don't have the continuity of care. So that patient that you would now see in the emergency department, they would be moved to a ward within a few hours, and you might never see them again. And then you'll be dealing with the next case. And I think that's detrimental to your training as well. So it's very tricky getting that balance. And I think when it was tough, at least people were all together. They would
Yeah.
say, well, let's we're having a bad evening, let's get some pizza in and have a meal together, and that built relationships. And I think all those things have made life much more difficult, particularly for junior doctors.
Mm.
Yeah.
So out of interest, the colleague that said to you, I wouldn't do medicine, what would you say now to a young person who is considering a career?
Considering medicine, I'd say if that's what you really want to do it. Absolutely. I think one of the real advantages of a career in medicine is the variety of careers and opportunities that are available at the end of it. So you can be so many different things. You could be an eye surgeon or hand surgeon. You could be working in the emergency department. You could be running an air ambulance service. You could be just outpatient based, like my cousin who did part-time dermatology. You could be looking after older people with a whole range of comorbidities and helping them to live independently. You could be a family doctor, seeing people in the community. You could be doing public health. You could be working overseas, thinking about infection or public health. You could be working in a laboratory, doing cutting edge medical research. You could go into medical journalism
Mm.
and just highlight all the social ills and health ills that beset us at the moment. So there is an opportunity to influence for good in whatever setting.
No, absolutely. Um, I not only agree, but I love that, Robina. And I think me was me on actually to just make a comment on you because you do have that very broad, diverse perspective actually. And I'm glad you're a medical educator. You teach the Imperial medical students, and I feel they need to hear that thing to really believe it and understand it because there were generations through the pandemic and things may have felt a bit low at that time, and they need to understand the wealth of benefits there are to a career in medicine and in research, and you've highlighted that in its broad depth, really. And actually, I think that says something about you, and I wonder where that's come from because I would say you as a leader are someone who really does offer encouragement, and you do it in a way that's clearly very strong, but also quite light touch. You're keen for the person that you're engaging with to give their perspective. You're keen for those diverse perspectives to thrive. You're looking for that individual and that team to kind of have that freedom to exercise what they want to do, and to exercise their visions.
Well, that's very kind of you, Kurt, and I take that as a great compliment. Um, yes, it is a product of a deliberate choice, and I think there are a number of factors that have led to that. So, when I reflect on the home I grew up in an intellectual liberal home, liberal professional home, but with lots of exposure to arts and culture alongside interests in science and so on. So I think that's one factor that probably influenced me. So I was always encouraged to be open to my creative side as well as explore science and medicine. Um, I was given two pieces of useful advice when I was training. As a medical student, a very good mentor said to me, he quoted Shakespeare to me, and he said, "To thine own self be true." So be true to yourself in 21st century language. And I think that's so important. And I think we're all guilty of it, but I think that social media has probably heightened the problem for young people, particularly at the moment. We are so taken up with our image and others' perception of us. And it is so easy. I mean, I think the pressures have always been there, but I do think they're very intense at the moment. The pressures are so strong to conform to an idealized image, or to conform to what you think other people think you should be. And there's obviously a place to conform in society. We need some, we need rules, we need to respect each other. There are boundaries. That's important. But I think being true to yourself, so learning what your strengths are, learning where your weaknesses are as well, and your blind spots, but being true to yourself is really important. So I think I found that really useful. I think the other piece of advice came when I was studying for my PhD, and I did a lab-based PhD in a laboratory full of basic scientists. So I was the only medical doctor in that lab, and that was a great 3.5 years during my career. And I had a fantastic head of department who was very generous and never treated us as though we were junior to him. He used to say, "Well, I was born before you were, so I'm a bit older." But one of the things he said to me, "Robina, when you are recruiting and when you are building your team," he said, "don't worry about recruiting people who are brighter than you." He said, "The fundamental mistake that people make when they're at the top of a head of a department or head of a team is they feel threatened by somebody they meet who is more intelligent than they are. And so they don't appoint them. So they only ever appoint people who are sort of a little bit beneath them. And that way they feel they're in control." He said, "Don't be threatened. Get really bright people in." And he said, if you're in a meeting, a departmental meeting one afternoon, they ask you a question you don't know the answer to, you say, "Well, that's a very good question, Steve. Why don't you go and look it up? Because I don't know the answer, and tell us all next week." And he said, you'll get a buzz. And he said, you'll get really bright people doing well, and they'll succeed in their careers. And so I've always remembered that. And I've always thought it's really, really important to cast aside one's own insecurities about what one might or might not have achieved or know, and actually say, who are the best people I can involve here? And if they do something that's absolutely fantastic that I couldn't even have thought of, fine, great, let them get on with it. So yes, I've always wanted to encourage people. I do believe that most people come to work wanting to do a good job. There are a few who don't, but they're in a very small minority, I think. So I want to encourage people. I think most people respond to encouragement. Most people respond to being supported and to being given that freedom and being able to use their imagination and their creativity in whatever they're doing. So I think those are some of the reasons.
Yeah, no, thank you. But it kind of cuts to a bottom line of, if we want better societies, we need to get the best out of people at this.
Yeah.
And if we keep playing an individual game, maybe perhaps based on, see, I often think about this related to how we're educated and why it is we might do exactly what your mentor said. Why is it that we choose people in the team that we feel are less smart than us, so that we stay in charge and we have the power, for example? Where does that necessarily come from our conditioning and our upbringing? And we know that that's not going to drive anything but segregation, really, and
Yes.
not very collective working communities. Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's maybe one thing that's coming out from the generational shifts, but actually it's been intrinsic to how you work, all over the last 35 years. But that is a conversation I do think is growing.
Yes.
That compassionate leadership.
Yes.
The idea of, functioning teams. And we've often even seen that from businesses.
Yes.
I know, inclusive businesses and how they're forming their teams and how they celebrate diversity purely for the benefit actually of their gain.
Yes.
It's not a social justice issue,
No.
which I'm very passionate about actually, that we don't talk about equality, diversity, and inclusion within the social justice space. It's not that it's not about social justice, but it's actually more about people,
Yeah.
societies,
Yes.
health equality,
Yes.
moving forward.
Yes. And getting better outcomes.
Getting better.
And the smart companies recognise that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
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 Yeah. Well, I think that leads us on a little bit to the next question in terms of clinical research.
Yes.
You've been clinical director. It's been a decade.
Yes, it's a terribly long time.
Well, you know, that's on Northwest London Clinical Research, and that's transitioning, new horizons, indeed, new change. But tricky question, probably, Robina. But what do you see as the achievements or successes?
Well, I think the first success, which is undoubtedly a very significant achievement, is the growth in primary care research. So again, it is about investing, getting the right people in, and then saying, right, now you run with it. And I have worked in hospitals all my career, and I really have no experience of working in general practice at all. So I don't feel I can possibly advise something about how to set up research in primary care. So I have been very dependent on listening to my colleagues who work in those settings and saying, okay, so what do you think we need to do? What do you think would work? And they've come back at every stage and said, well, this is our proposal, but it's going to need some investment. And we've been very fortunate that our executive have backed us and supported us when we've gone to them and said, look, we think we need to invest more in primary care research. But the teams have come up with very concrete proposals and justifications for those proposals, and they've got a logical plan, and it's worked. It's paid off. It is always a risk because you look at the sums and you think, oh, it's quite a lot of money. Fine. Okay, go. See what you can do. And this is what they've done. So all credit to them. They've done an absolutely fantastic job. And I think that is one of the major achievements. And I think it's very significant that now the new research delivery networks recognise the achievements in primary care and recognise that we must not lose this. We have to protect this and develop it.
Yeah.
That's one great achievement. And then I think the other thing was, the other two things were initiatives that were started during the pandemic, because pandemics are always a great stimulus to innovation. And again, this relies on other people's work, not my personal work. But we set up the Northwest London Clinical Trials Alliance, and this was to develop urgent COVID vaccine studies. And unlike previously, we had a collaborative model. So it was a sort of taxi rank model. So in the past, different sites across Northwest London would have competed for commercial studies. But this was set up with the idea that, right, okay, there's commercial study A here. You're all in a queue, but you're all together. Which of you would like to take that study? Okay, so trust one says it's going to take study A. Fine, you go and work that, run with it, get on with it, complete it. Study B comes along and trust two says, I can take that. Okay. And then they run with that one. So they're not competing. They're just saying, yeah, I'm ready for that. I've got facilities. We've got the patient population. We can do that. So who is best suited? So it was a very collaborative approach, which hadn't been followed before in Northwest London. There were actually similar initiatives around the country. So we weren't completely alone in that. But we were very successful in recruiting to COVID vaccine studies. And it's now been extended across Northwest London. And it was recognised to be pretty novel in its method of working. And the Alliance was shortlisted for the New Statements Inaugural Positive Impact Awards in 2022 in recognition of its contribution to healthcare research. So we were very excited and delighted about that. So that's a second thing. And then the thing I'm really proud of as well is the Schools Research Network. And that was also set up during the pandemic. And that's a collaboration. We have over 60 schools involved. And it's really interesting. These are primary schools, they're secondary schools, they're state schools, they're private schools. There's a collaboration with Imperial College London, Listen to Act, which is a community-based organisation, and the NIHR ARC, the Applied Research Collaboration. And what's fantastic about that is that the school students have been actively involved in helping to design the research. So researchers have gone along and said, well, we want to do a study on this. And in fact, we said, well, what would you like to do research? And I'll have research and be involved in what sort of research. And they said mental health.
Yeah.
And this was in 2021, 2022. So he said, fine. So some research went along and said, well, we want to do this study in mental health. And these are the questions we'd like to ask. And so the students have, they've had focus groups. And the students have come along and said, well, I don't think that one works. I don't think much that question. You won't get anybody interested in that. You need to ask this and you need to ask that. And the researchers have actually gone back and said, we need to change because we're not going to get engagement. And they've changed the questions. They've changed the design of the studies. So the students have helped to co-create those studies and they've been enormously successful. And that's led to very high levels of engagement and positive feedback, not just from the students, but from the teachers as well. The teachers have been really interested. And it's also interesting because particularly with the mental health studies, we often, when we started recruiting, for instance, to a randomized placebo-controlled intervention study in secondary care, we say to the patients, we don't know what you'll get. We don't know whether you'll get a dummy drug, sugar pill, or whether you'll get the active drug, and you won't be able to know. We won't know, and we don't know whether you'll get any benefit from this study. But you'll be doing it for the future and future liberations. So they do it out of the goodness of their heart. But what's really interesting is that some of these sort of focus groups that were part of the research, because groups of students were coming together and they were actually being encouraged and enabled to talk about their mental health, that was actually therapeutic in their self. And they've given feedback about that. So the students could see the benefit. The teachers could see the benefit. And I think, because there were professional facilitators and clinical psychologists coming in, that was enormously beneficial. So yes, it was research, but it was benefiting the participants, which is really interesting.
And the other fascinating thing, just because I remember it now that you're talking about it, was how the network has elevated skills for young people.
Yes.
So the young people have said, we want to know how to have basic skills in managing mental health emergencies, which actually I have to say, when you hear that, it just warms your heart. That's what young people are saying, and we might take for granted that's what they want. But also presentation skills.
Yes.
You've got leaders from Imperial tailoring presentation skills for young people. It's phenomenal. There's huge amounts of learning to come from.
Yes. And absolutely. And then the other nice aspect, of course, is that we're not only involving the children or the students in that research, who will be, because they're in Northwest London, they will be from very many different and diverse communities throughout Northwest London, but you're engaging their parents, because at the very least, their parents have to consent for their child to take part. And so they have to read the participation in participants information sheet and read about the study and learn about the study. So they're actually getting some exposure, and they're learning that actually, it was useful to him, he liked it, So they're getting a very positive feedback and having a positive research. So we're reaching out to all sorts of diverse communities that way.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. There was a wonderful community member who gave a talk at the sickle cell awareness disease event. And she was actually saying that one of the things you really need to do as an NHS or academic space to build trust is you need to involve people's families.
Yes.
The wider community. Yes. We trust them.
Yes.
We will speak to our parents about this. We will, and what they say and what they feel is going to be important. So yes, it needs to be engaging, but it ties in with that, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
So given the incredible work from the CRN, Robina, thank you for summarizing it. Really, as a last question for you, is there any things that, if you had wishes, for example, how would you want to see clinical research progress, or not necessarily change, maybe evolve, but where would you like to see progress?
Well, I think there are two key areas. The first is in terms of patient and volunteer perception of research. So we've talked about some really good examples, but we're not reaching everywhere and we're not reaching everybody. So anything we can do to build that trust, I think, is really important. So I think that is going to have to be a focus. And the second thing I think actually is working on engagement from healthcare professionals. And I'm not just talking about doctors, I'm talking about the wider healthcare professions. Because there's no doubt in this country that our healthcare service is under enormous pressure. And we know that patient satisfaction has plummeted. People are very concerned about access to primary care. timely access to emergency care, timely access to an ambulance. And so it's a very difficult environment, I think, in which to prosecute successful clinical research, because clinical research is always seen as an add-on, a luxury, and a nice to have and a good to do, and it's not always seen as fundamental. And we know that, for instance, hospitals that are active in clinical research have a better outcomes. Clinical outcomes. And that's not just for the patients who are involved in research, it's for all patients in that institution. And many of us know that, but I'm not sure how widely broadcast that is. And we know it's a great thing for recruiting clinical staff. It's great for staff retention. But unless we make time available for healthcare professionals to do research as part of their clinical work, I think we're going to struggle. And that's always been regarded as a bit too expensive and a bit too difficult. But we do insist that, for instance, doctors and many other allied healthcare professions have time for CPD, personal professional development, and they have time to teach others. So we regard education as important. I think we need to be seeing research on the same level and in the same way. And I'm not suggesting that everybody should be a laboratory researcher or that everybody should be publishing in high-level journals all the time. But it might just be saying, okay, so there's this study running in my department, and I know that Bob's doing that, and I know he would like me to have a look through my clinics and see if there are any patients. And, how can I help with that? And having a bit of time to do that and having that recognised as part of what we do, rather than just being, well, I'll try and do it after 5 o'clock, and actually, no, I won't, and as you say, it's difficult now because there's less goodwill to work and go over and above normal working hours. So people don't want to do that. And if they can sign off at 5 o'clock and go and help their son with their homework, they're going to do that. So that's much more the attitude. So I think we really do need to think about how we motivate, engage, and reward and recognise people for their efforts and make it integral to what they do in their daily work.
Absolutely makes sense. Made me think of the point that often it's that communication challenge between a doctor and perhaps a potential research participant who may be a patient, and how they're communicating about research. The more we do it, the more it becomes part of our everyday, the better we can communicate it.
Yes.
And have the language and the articulation to make it much more part of routine care, much more embedded in trust and honesty.
Yes.
It's fundamental, isn't it?
It is.
Robina, thank you so much. I'm really grateful that you've actually tackled some quite big topics. And I'd say that you've talked a lot, although you may not have used those words. You're clearly talking about humility and honesty within our roles, within people who are in medicine and in research. And that's intrinsic to your leadership style and to who you are. So thank you so much. Real privilege to speak with you. I've loved working with you in this last 1 to 2 years. And I wish you all the absolute best. And I think there's huge amounts that I think the new system needs to learn from the CRN, learn from your leadership style. And I look forward to that happening.
Thank you very much, Keerti. It's been fantastic having you as part of the team. And it's been a great pleasure to be with you today. Thank you.
This was an episode of the NIHR podcast, part of our EDI series, Conversations to Cultivate Change. I'm Keerti Gedela, and thank you for listening. For more information about the NIHR, you can visit our website, nihr.ac.uk.